saying, quote, "The 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first, and Make America Great Again, will have a giant voice looking into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form." President Trump also condemning the actions of those who broke away from that protest to infiltrate the Capitol building on Wednesday. Because unlike many Democratic leaders who failed to discourage acts of violence coming from extremists within their own party, the president knows that violence is not the answer.
I would like to begin by addressing the heinous attack on the United States Capitol. Like all Americans, I am outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem. I immediately deployed the National Guard and federal law enforcement to secure the building and expel the intruders. America is and must always be a nation of law and order.
Joining me now to analyze the District of Columbia's Police Department's reaction to the January 6th event, Lieutenant Steve Rogers, former member of the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. So, Steve, I really appreciate you coming on right now because there are a lot of questions about exactly what happened on Wednesday, how it was allowed to happen, and really what we can do to prevent anything like that from happening again. So first, do you think that Capitol Hill police were just ill-prepared for Wednesday?
Well, I'm going to put it in very direct perspective. To begin with, in my 40 years in law enforcement, I've never seen a more catastrophic event take place as a result of not the cops failing the people, but the political leadership failing the people. Alex, keep in mind that these people who want the president, they want to blame him and blame the cops. They're the same people who are crying, defund the police, take the equipment away that they need to enforce the law. Criminal justice reform that favors the criminals more than the victims. I mean, I could go right up and down the list. And when did you ever see, in your day and age, cops running away from crowds? The cops used to run into the crowds. But again, I'm not blaming the cops. It's the mayor of Washington and it's those Democrat socialists in Congress that put together the ingredients to what we saw take place.
And, you know, you do bring up a good point because I think that the Capitol Hill police were put in a situation where they couldn't have succeeded. I mean, on one hand, for example, they are being blamed for many people for not being forceful enough. And on the other hand, they're being criticized for shooting the one woman who tragically died in this event. So I think it's a lose-lose situation when it comes to this as well. But when I look at this, part of me is thinking, I'm glad that this wasn't worse. I'm glad that the people who ended up taking the Capitol building didn't have even more malicious means or anything like that because, for example, if it was a nefarious power, or for example, the night before, even Iran was reportedly making threats against the United States, this situation could have been worse. Am I wrong?
Well, what about this scenario? What about the fact that we now know as a result of this terrible event that our security there was so weak, suicide bombers could have virtually walked right into that building with our entire U.S. government in assembly and kill everybody. So absolutely, it could have been more terribly worse. But now that we know, we have to move forward, not to blame the president. He's not to blame for this. The cops aren't to blame for this. But the people who are blaming everybody else are to blame for this.
And, you know, it's another one of these conversations, I'm kind of sick of them, to be completely honest, where it's either you're anti-Trump or you're pro-Trump, and you have to pick a side. You can't look at it just in the vacuum that it should be looked at. And I think that this is one of those instances. So many people want to blame President Trump. So many people want to blame the police officers that we can't just look at this situation in a sober way and really just come to a conclusion of how we can improve. How we can make sure that this doesn't happen again, that suicide bombers, for example, can't come into the nation's capital. So when we look at this situation, do you think that there are some reforms that have to be made? I know that the sergeant at arms has stepped down, the Capitol Hill police, for example, may be stepping down. Do you think that there are reforms that could be made in a way to prevent anything like this from happening?
Yes, substantial reforms. To begin with, stop the nonsense of defunding the police. In this day and age, you have to fund the police, excessively fund them. To do what? To gather intelligence and information on the ground, on the cyber nets. You've got to get and gather information. More cops out on the street, not only visibly, but your tactical units there. And then preparedness. They weren't prepared. So all this costs money. So step number one, let's stop the nonsense of defunding the police. If we learned anything, give them the tools and the money they need to protect us proactively rather than reactively.
And Steve, before I let you go too, I know that you have a pulse on the way that really the police unions across the country and police officers, more importantly, are viewing the way of the upcoming administration, because it wasn't too long ago where you're right. The defund the police movement was controlling the headlines, and there were concerns about what a Biden administration would mean for our nation's law enforcement, not only from a funding angle, but from the support that they'll get in some of these hard situations where it seems to be trial by media, things of that nature. How are police around the country feeling right now about the prospect of this Biden administration?
It's frightening, it's chilling, and I must tell you that they've already employed a tactic known as de-escalation, tactfully retreat. That doesn't mean they're not going to do their job, but you can be sure many of them have told me they will not fire one shot unless they are fired upon. That is dangerous. That's not being proactive. That's being very dangerously and close to death reactive.
And in fact, we've seen situations like that play out where it ends up that the police officers running away only to be chased, get their weapon taken in some situations. It is a troubling perspective, not only from a deterrent mechanism, but really the idea for our communities as well, because people forget at the end of the day, when you take away police, when you take away their funding, it's not just the police that suffer, it's the communities as well, because it's less money for training, less money to pay people who may be qualified police officers. It's a trickle down type of effect that doesn't stop at the police department, but with the people in those communities as well. But Steve Rogers, it's always a pleasure having you on this program and giving your insight into this issue. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And still ahead, a shift is happening